right, here we go. Der Spiegel. Germany has little maneuvering room in Ukraine conflict. The US wants to impose harsh sanctions on Russia invades Ukraine. Did we already read that one? Yeah, because the typo. What about this one? What sanctions could hurt Russia? Okay, everything is set up. Looks good. Hello. When it comes to word choice, the West is in complete agreement. A Russian attack on Ukraine would carry quote-unquote political consequences and a heavy price, insist both Washington and Brussels. The European Union's chief foreign policy representative, Josep Borrell, said recently that the bloc is preparing a full set of sanctions against Moscow. The problem, though, is that the consequences of such punitive measures for the Russian economy aren't always predictable, and the harm to one's own economy can be significant. Should the West stop buying Russian oil and gas, what would be the ramifications of a boycott on Russia's tech sector or of excluding the country from the SWIFT international bank transfer system? How can the West punish Putin without shooting itself in the foot? Opinions on such questions diverge significantly when Europeans and Americans start considering possible responses to the warmongering of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The power of semiconductors. It is indisputable that Russia's economy would be hit hard if the West cut deliveries of microchips to the country in response to an invasion. Such a move would be damaging to the aircraft industry and to the arms industry, both of which are key to Russian exports and to the country's prestige. Additional measures under discussion include limitations on deliveries of parts necessary for the construction of warplanes and rockets. Even simple semiconductors that cost just a few euros each could serve as important leverage. The global chip industry is largely dominated by companies from the US and its allies, with the most state-of-the-art factories located in the US, Europe, Taiwan, and South Korea. With its sanctions against Huawei, the US has already demonstrated just how effectively chip supplies can be used as a weapon against rivals. Since the administration of ex-President Donald Trump limited the export of smartphone processors to Huawei, the Chinese tech company's sales have plummeted. Russia is home to very few, mostly aging factories, and they rely heavily on Western patents. The computer producer IRU, for example, which is working on developing a desktop computer made completely in Russia, imports its processors from Taiwan. And the chip producer Angstrom T went bankrupt in 2019 after it was forced to cut ties with its American partners due to sanctions imposed after Moscow's incursion into Crimea. And what do we see here? Severely battered Russian gross domestic product percent change from previous year, and Russian foreign debt in billions of dollars. Still, it would take several months for a chip boycott to have much of an effect. Cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, the backbone of the financial world, by contrast, would have an immediate impact. We've seen this option in all the articles that we've read together in our recent live streams. Around 11,000 banks in more than 200 countries use the network to take care of cross-border transactions. Because of the massive consequences, a credible threat to exclude Russia from SWIFT would be extremely effective, says this director of the Austrian Institute of Economic Research in Vienna. Although the collateral damage of such a move would be significant, even as companies in Russia would have to find elaborate alternate routes to pay for their foreign bills, and the cross-border flow of cash and goods would trickle to a stop, the West would suffer as well. Exports to Russia from companies in Europe could no longer be paid for, and Europe, this is the big point from the previous articles, would be unable to pay for natural gas deliveries from Russia. Those of you who know, who are watching this, who are experts in this topic, what would be the solution for Europe to be able to pay Russia outside of the SWIFT system to protect its own interests without getting, without getting in trouble for doing that, so to speak? Is there any way around this situation? How would you analyze it? What would you do about it? Russia would not be able to have Europe pay it for natural gas deliveries. In other words, Europe would be shooting itself in the foot if it banned Russia from the SWIFT system. Furthermore, Russian debt held by European banks would be jeopardized. Such considerations led Friedrich Merz, the likely next head of Germany's CDU, to warn of an atomic bomb for the financial markets. A sanction that Moscow would really understand. The problems would be of a similar magnitude if the West were to stop imports of oil and natural gas from Russia. That too, says Felbermayr, would be a sanction that Moscow would really understand, stopping the imports of oil and natural gas, but it would also have grave consequences for the West. Too many intertwined energy-related interests. Around 55% of Germany's natural gas comes from Russia. Theoretically, Berlin could turn to other countries for help, but there aren't enough liquefied natural gas terminals in Europe and none in Germany. At the same time, prices for liquefied gas would skyrocket. German storage facilities are emptier than they have been in a long time, and because the markets have been liberalized, the government doesn't have too many levers to counteract such price pressures. German Economics Minister Robert Habeck, for his part, has promised to exert more control over the gas market. We have to improve our ability to prepare for next winter so that the gas storage facilities are full, he said in an interview with Der Spiegel this week. He also said that he intended to reform the entire market, but such promises are of little help in the current conflict, which is why suspension of gas imports seems just as unlikely as shutting Russia out of the SWIFT system. So a couple of areas where you might think that sanctions could hit Russia hard may not take place because they end up having the effect of shooting oneself in the foot, at least in the case of Germany. The situation looks different when it comes to Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline between Germany and Russia. That delivery route is not urgently needed, assuming that Russia doesn't cut off deliveries through the existing pipelines. Germany and the US have agreed that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline will not go into operation should Russia start a war. I'm trying to think. That's not what we read in the earlier articles. A deal made between US President Joe Biden and former German Chancellor Angela Merkel before she left office, which means that everything depends on what Russia does next and whether it is then seen as the beginning of a war, or whether Russia seeks to destabilize Ukraine without actually launching a physical invasion. Again, that could be the case, just using recognition of the territories in the Donbass and other kinds of diplomatic measures that fall short of a physical invasion. The West, says a high-ranking EU diplomat, will provide an appropriate and coordinated response. Well, that wasn't a very good article because what sanctions could hurt Russia? Well, apparently nothing, because they're also going to have the effect of hurting Germany. So did the author of this article mean to suggest that the only available sanctions lever for Germany is Nord Stream 2? That was that article. What else? Germany has a Russia problem. Just going to see whether we can read this. I'm not a paying subscriber of Der Spiegel, so we're just reading what we can pull up here. Hello to those of you who are here, who are watching now, or who will be watching later. I always appreciate you spending your time here. I hope you find this interesting. Just lately reading articles and analysis that helps us to understand what's going on in Russia, in the Ukraine, and in related areas. I see some comments here in the chat. I always appreciate you guys hashing it out in the chat and the comments, sharing what you think about the articles, how you react to their main arguments and things like that. Let's just go over to this article. Germany has a Russia problem. Russian President Vladimir Putin is seeking to shift the balance of power in Europe and is even threatening war. So far, the German government hasn't provided a clear answer to the threat. The problem is primarily a product of the party of Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So this is going to get us into the weeds of German party politics. And will we be better off for having gone there? I guess we won't find out until we do it. There's a clear and present danger of a war of aggression in Europe, but the German government doesn't seem to have recognized it yet. What other explanation could there be for Berlin's inexplicable paralysis in its approach to Russia? By the way, it's helpful to have read this kind of thing, because later when you hear American spokesmen talking about the situation, and they say, all the allies are on the same page, there's no daylight, this is a completely unanimous agreement, everybody's convinced that this is what's in our interests and all of that, you will at least have some nuance that, well, maybe that's not the case in all cases, and why it isn't. It is all the more disconcerting because Germany, as the most important member state in the European Union, should be playing a key role in the standoff. But it is far from living up to that responsibility. Russia is threatening war against Ukraine, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's response has been a vague threat of consequences should Moscow decide to invade. What kinds of consequences he hasn't said. Bear in mind, this is almost a week old, this article. The reason for the tentative approach is clear. The tri-party coalition government of Scholz's Social Democrats, the business-friendly Free Democrats, and the Greens hasn't come to an agreement on what sort of punitive measures might be deployed. And in such a grave situation as the one developing on Ukraine's eastern border, that is a catastrophe. Remember, we had an article in one of the previous live streams, might have even been the one this morning, where Fiona Hill had argued that Putin has the upper hand in part because he can just do what he wants to do. He doesn't have the obstacles that you have in Western democratic systems structurally. And here the author's arguing that this tri-party coalition is a obstacle to having Germany come to an agreement on what sort of punitive measures might be deployed. The gravity of Russia's militant behavior is not particularly difficult to recognize. Satellite images and videos offer proof of the concentration of Russian troops near the Ukrainian border and evidence that units from far-flung areas of Russia have been relocated to the country's western frontier. More than 100,000 soldiers are now stationed there, along with tanks and heavy artillery. Russia has not only issued an ultimatum to the Americans and Europeans that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO, it's also demanded that the entire European security regime of the last 25 years be revised because Moscow allegedly feels as though it is being encircled by NATO. Russia, a nice reminder for those of you who need one, is demanding that all NATO troops be withdrawn from alliance member states in Eastern Europe, and it wants a guarantee that the neighboring Scandinavian countries of Finland and Sweden will never join the alliance. Last week, representatives from the US and Russia met in Geneva for talks, but afterward, Deputy Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov wasn't interested in further negotiations because the Americans and NATO weren't inclined to meet the entire catalog of Moscow's maximalist demands. Okay, this is all background. You know this, I think, week-old materials. Despite this alarmingly global political crisis, the German government has been surprisingly reserved in its comments. Chancellor Scholz has notably been reticent and over-reliant on formulaic banalities. Wow. He's not the only one in government relying on those. I think it's an obligation to be in government. The government has emphasized that it would act in concert with the EU and NATO if Russia were to launch an attack, but Berlin hasn't even been able to promise that it would put a stop to the Baltic Sea gas pipeline Nord Stream 2. Always comes up in these analyses. In the event of war, the pipeline has long been extremely controversial because it would allow for the direct delivery of natural gas from Russia and Germany, circumventing both Ukraine and Poland. Berlin apparently continues to think it conceivable that gas will ultimately flow through the pipeline, even if Russia attacks Ukraine. Okay, that's the key interest coming up all the time in the analysis here in the German press. The status in the sanctions regime of Nord Stream 2. What then is the value of all the talk of consequences? In German political circles, all kinds of people are currently talking not about what Berlin will do in response to a Russian attack, rather they're focusing on what they won't do. That doesn't just apply to politicians belonging to the coalition parties, but is also true of Friedrich Merz, who's set to be voted in as the next leader of the conservative CDU in coming days. And we saw him come up in the last article. Last weekend, he expressed his opposition to excluding Russia from the global payment system SWIFT, which is one of the most painful potential sanctions that has been proposed. Such a step would block the access of Russian banks and companies to international payment flows. And ruling out all kinds of tough sanctions both relieves pressure on Moscow and sends a clear message: Moscow can rely on Berlin's inactivity. Indeed, with Germany looking weak and divided, Moscow can feel emboldened in its current course, especially given that there are prominent apologists for Russia's aggressive policies within the governing coalition. people who don't necessarily agree with the American interpretation of global affairs. The greatest handicap for Germany's foreign policy is currently Chancellor Scholz's SPD. Large swaths of the party, as the current crisis has laid bare, continue to be mired in nostalgia when it comes to their approach to Moscow, a wistfulness that one might be more likely to associate with the left party. On Germany's far left, admiration of authoritarian regimes is standard. The US, they tend to believe, is evil, while Russia isn't considered to be all that bad. The degree of denial currently on display within the SPD, though, is shocking. Last weekend on Twitter, SPD parliamentarian Ralph Stegner dished up a veritable greatest hits of this approach to international relations. He complained of the disconcerting tone in German commentaries about Russia and diagnosed rhetorical saber rattling. Commentators are adopting a Cold War tone, he wrote, adding that a unilateral arms buildup and spiral of sanctions is being demanded, where diplomacy and a lowering of tensions is badly needed. It is a rather bizarre message, according to the author of this article. For Stegner, a credible deterrence against Russia and support for Ukraine is saber rattling, but he completely ignores Moscow's actual saber rattling. As a reminder, Russia has positioned an entire army, namely its own, on Ukraine's border, i.e. within Russia's own territory, and is unilaterally threatening war. Stegner's tweet storm wouldn't be complete, of course, without mentioning Ostpolitik. For many in the SPD, it is a kind of magic word for everything that somehow has to do with Russia. The word refers to Chancellor Willy Brandt's policy of change through rapprochement in the 1970s. But the situation then was completely different than it is today. Back then, it was about easing tensions between two huge power blocks and not about an antagonist seeking to shift borders and expand its sphere of influence through the concrete threat of war. Ostpolitik, it should be mentioned, didn't involve a country that openly attacked its political opponents in the West with poison and other forms of deadly violence. Taking shots here. When an SPD member demands Ostpolitik these days, it's merely a salve on the SPD soul and an expression of understanding for Russia. Okay, so a lot of implicit, explicit accusations here that SPD is letting itself be walked over by Russian interests. Ralph Stegner, it should be mentioned, isn't a particularly important figure within the SPD, but he's symptomatic of this party. And he's far from being the only SPD politician who has displayed a somewhat fragile connection to reality in this crisis. Rolf Mützenich, the SPD floor leader in parliament, has been giving one interview after the next lately in which he expresses a significant amount of understanding for Russia's feelings of being under threat and very little for the same feelings among Russia's neighbors. In December, he demanded an end to the reciprocal threats in the Ukraine crisis, but when did Ukraine threaten Russia and with what? So he probably has in mind the threats between Russia and NATO or Russia and the West, but I guess the author points out justifiably that Ukraine finds itself caught in the crosshairs to a certain extent, and you could say has a fair claim, maybe the fairest claim, to have its interests heard and assessed. And yet, when this figure here, Rolf Mützenich, talks about reciprocal threats, presumably he's not talking about Russia-Ukraine so much as he's talking about Russia and NATO. Of course, the Russian view must be considered, but not at the precise moment when Russia is holding a pistol to the head of its neighbor. And by all accounts, as I'm sure you know, that's how Russia feels about its status, that there's sort of a pistol to its head. But anyway, we don't need to get into that. Let's get the author's view here. SPD General Secretary Kevin Kühnert even went so far as to say that one should be careful not to fuel potential international crises through overwrought rhetoric. Well, didn't you say yesterday or today that you also don't want to have overly dramatic gestures? Kühnert claimed that such rhetoric was aimed at putting an end to certain projects that have always been a thorn in the side. He was talking about Nord Stream 2, the pipeline of which the Green Party, the SPD's coalition partner, has been skeptical for years. The debate over Nord Stream 2 and Russia's approach to Ukraine should not be mixed, he said. Let's read this poll quote. Part of the problem is that many within the SPD and in Germany at large continue to see Gerhard Schroeder as a completely normal ex-chancellor and as an elder statesman. In fact, though, he's nothing other than a paid lobbyist on Moscow's payroll. So this article really, really hitting hard pro-Russian sentiment in the SPD. Using that logic, one could also argue that the needs of Germany's export industry should be kept apart from a potential invasion of Ukraine, but because Europe, with good reason, isn't interested in getting involved in armed conflict itself, economic sanctions are the strongest measures currently available, and yet we have all the problems we've been discussing recently. It's difficult to understand why so many SPD members insist on excluding this pipeline project from possible sanctions, a project that has already served to isolate Germany within the Western alliance for the past several years. getting too close for comfort with Russia. Does it perhaps have to do with the fact that the pipeline's origins are directly connected to the SPD, particularly with Gerhard Schröder, the last SPD chancellor of Germany? Shortly before he was voted out of office, Schröder agreed to the deal for the first Nord Stream pipeline with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and then immediately became chairman of the board of the company operating the pipeline after he left office. He's now also chairman of the board of directors of the Russian oil company Rosneft. Part of the problem is that many within the SPD and in Germany at large continue to see Schröder as a completely normal ex-chancellor. In fact, though, he's nothing other than a paid lobbyist on Moscow's payroll. Okay, the argument here is that the attachment to Nord Stream has to do with the attachment to this figure whose involvement with Nord Stream is not one of statesmanship, certainly nothing normal, but rather money, money, money. Still, Exhibit A of the problematic relationship to Russia maintained by elements of the SPD is perhaps Manuela Schwesig, governor of the state of Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania, in which the German terminal of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is located. In order to circumvent American sanctions aimed at the pipeline, and even to deploy a ship to finish the project, she relied on Russian money to establish an environmental foundation, quote-unquote environmental. Most political parties in Europe receiving Russian funding are of the right-wing populist variety. I'm sure you've all heard claims about Alternative for Deutschland and Le Pen. But now money from Moscow is flowing into a foundation belonging to an SPD-led state government. Okay? Compromised is the name of the game here, the name of the claim. Luckily, there are important exceptions within the party. Among them is Michael Roth, head of the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the Bundestag, Germany's parliament. In comments to Der Spiegel, he supported using Nord Stream 2 as a bargaining chip and demanded that Germany show, quote-unquote, resolve in its interactions with Russia. He too invokes Ostpolitik, but he refreshingly applies a different definition to it than others in his party. A new European Ostpolitik, Roth says, should also include the security interests of our Central European partners. Those interests, as it happens, are often ignored by many Russian apologists. They like to speak of Russia as a neighbor, as though Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states didn't exist. During the campaign, Scholz claimed that if he was chosen to lead Germany, whoever ordered leadership from him would also get it. If that's the case, it's high time for him to find clear words from Moscow, particularly given the mixed messages and appeasement rhetoric coming from his own party. Scholz is not a member of the pro-Russia wing in his party, but he's too frequently repeated the untruth that the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is, quote, purely a private economic venture. It's very hard to believe that Scholz doesn't recognize the political dimensions of this project. Indeed, Putin himself made it clear last autumn that he sees the pipeline as a tool for exerting pressure. He said he would only consider delivering more gas to Western Europe if Nord Stream 2 was allowed to commence operations. And Germany's Eastern European neighbors have always seen the pipeline as a geopolitical project, as has the US, even if the Biden administration has recently bent over backwards to prevent Congress in Washington from slapping sanctions on Germany in the middle of ongoing tensions with Russia. As such, Germany's ongoing prevaricating is a slap in the face of its allies. US government representatives are careful to emphasize unity with Germany in public, and you heard maybe a press briefing earlier today in which unity between the US and its allies was constantly emphasized, despite a lot of pushback from the press saying, well, we have reports that no, there is daylight and there's a lot of disagreement. So US government representatives are careful to emphasize unity with Germany in public, but behind the scenes, Germany's continued unwillingness to say that Nord Stream 2 pipeline could be part of a package of sanctions has been met with bewilderment in Washington among many who are otherwise well disposed to Germany. So you see Nord Stream 2, okay, a hugely important issue here, creating a rift between American and German policymakers about the extent to which you can apply it as a bargaining chip in a sanctions regime against Russia. The only person in the German government who has taken a clearer position so far is Foreign Minister Baerbock, whose Green Party has clearly opposed Russian hegemonic ambitions in the past, as have large parts of the Free Democratic Party. The two smaller partners in the coalition government in Berlin have a more realistic stance on Russia than the SPD. This offers a glimmer of hope that the government could ultimately wind up adopting robust measures after all. Yeah, so two partners in the coalition versus this Russia-leaning party in the coalition. The fact that the foreign minister first made a stopover in Ukraine before her meeting on Tuesday with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov served as an important gesture. However, the Chancellery has claimed the lead in foreign policy since the start of the new Russia crisis and is literally slamming the brakes on Baerbock. Literally. It is now up to Chancellor Scholz to counter the tendencies toward Russian nostalgia in his party and clearly commit to possible punitive measures. These would, of course, also have to include Nord Stream 2. Europe will remain weak for as long as Germany hesitates in clearly pointing out the possible consequences to Moscow. Who's going to take the blame if something goes wrong? Germany hesitates. Okay, the Germans are going to bear a brunt of blame if they continue to withhold. I mean, it's one way you could look at it. It's safe to say that Germany must be far more active when it comes to the future of Europe, its security order, and Russia's future influence on the continent. If anybody here has good articles about the French position, put them in the chat and I'll go over them. This has long since ceased to be just about Ukraine, which Russia views as being part of its historical territory. For Vladimir Putin, this is not just about averting danger, but also about restoring power and influence in Europe, using the only means he has, the military. Admittedly, his country's economic output is only just twice that of Switzerland, with 17 times as many inhabitants. Russia's military, however, has shown in recent years, from Georgia to Syria and Crimea, that it is capable of waging wars effectively. One can't rule out the notion that the conflict would not stop at Ukraine's borders. Okay, one can't rule that notion out. So he's not saying absolutely Russian tanks are going to go here, there, and everywhere. You just have to have it in your analysis. Russian representatives are already making indirect threats against other states. Permanent representative of Russia to international organizations in Vienna, for example, recently claimed that the Baltic states' membership in NATO destabilizes their immediate surroundings. Most recently, Sweden, which is not a member of NATO, sent additional troops to the Baltic island of Gotland in response to increased Russian activities in the region. And just in case any of you haven't seen where that is, okay. Sweden has sent troops here. 4.6 looks like a nice place. The German government must respond to the threat from Russia. Berlin should reconsider its opposition to arms deliveries to Ukraine. It is incomprehensible that Germany is refusing the support to a partner country in such dire need. Incomprehensible. No, it's comprehensible. We've been comprehending it together on the basis of reading a few publicly available articles. Okay, it's entirely comprehensible. It's a matter of interests and weighing them. It's a given that Germany and Europe need to agree on their own military deterrent in the face of the new Russian threat. You can't have analysts call something incomprehensible that's entirely comprehensible. Might be disputable, but it's not incomprehensible. Above all, though, it's time for the SPD to give itself a reality check. In Germany's left-wing circles, the word warmonger remains popular vocabulary for discrediting anyone calling for an economic, military, and political strategy in the face of Russia's destabilizing and bellicose intentions. You know that, right? If you want to take military action, you're a warmonger, you're pro-war, and all of that. That rhetoric is obviously there, not just in Germany. It's a nice, handy phrase for delegitimizing and discrediting anybody who does want to take economic, military, and political action, not just in this case, but in other cases. In those circles, anything Russia does is never half as bad as what the US or Europe does to ensure their security. But there can be no doubt these days about just who is the true warmonger and wager of wars. It is imperative that this fact is recognized, not only that the German government and particularly the Chancellor's party, SPD, but also that they act accordingly. It's imperative that this fact is recognized, okay, not only by the German government and the Chancellor's party, but the SPD, and they act accordingly. So this was a Der Spiegel article. Again, we're just getting a German perspective and one take on the German perspective. Head of Der Spiegel's foreign desk: Germany has a Russia problem. I'll see what else is in there. Let me pop over to the chat. Is that not coming up? The program I use for streaming, I like it, but I don't love it. How's that? Okay. Terrible picture of Putin. They always choose the worst pictures of the man. My view of the conflict: was the Ukrainian coup actually organic, a wholly CIA-created movement? I don't have too much to say about that tonight. I'm confident the coup was CIA orchestrated. Someone else writes, really enjoyed the Peterson Dugan stream. Thank you, I appreciate that. Thumbs down from somebody. It's all right, you're here. If you don't like it, you can leave. But you're here. I'm not watching your stream, you're watching my stream. Crypto, this was about getting around SWIFT. Sanctions. Crypto could eliminate corruption, make government spending fully transparent, but I don't think they'd want that. Coalition of the willing, bipartisan coalition, guarantee disaster. Why did I decide to read Spiegel? Yeah, I'm just reading mainstream articles and their analysis. There are a million things we could read. We could go to different languages. We could go to Russian sources. Okay, just reading what I would want to read just to get a sense of some take, some perspective, some account, some analysis, and I just figured that we'd do it like this. That's why. But feel free, if you have other articles that you'd like to see me go over, drop them in the chat, drop them in the comments, and if they seem interesting to me, then I will go over them. Hey, Logan, hello. Good evening. Hello, hello, hello. Nice to see everybody. Appreciate you being here. Some more comments here. Main factions ideas in Germany regarding Russia. Well, this gave us a sense of it. The parties that are in the coalition, which ones are favorably predisposed to Russia and protective of Nord Stream 2, and which ones are not favorably predisposed to Russia and willing to put Nord Stream 2 up at stake. All right, well, I'm just going to keep poking around because I'm in the mood to read a few more articles. You're welcome to stay. You're welcome to go if you're watching this later. Let's see. Anything else here? It's time to treat Putin like an adversary, not a partner. I mean, to a certain extent, you don't want the articles to be entirely predictable, which in many cases they are. Navalny, unbroken after a year in prison. Okay, let's go to another topic because I saw something in the Canadian newspapers I wanted to read. You may know that there's this truckers protest. Truckers are the proxy protesters for a lot of angry Canadians. Freedom Convoy is a vicarious protest for people. And this author, Rex Murphy, well-known Canadian editorialist, wrote this article, but that's not what I want to read. He linked to something, to a letter written by a trucker, and that's what I'd like us to look at. The average age of a trucker is 58. So let me just tell you what we're reading. January 24th, that means this came out today. The site is called Small Dead Animals. That's what it's called, okay. 2008 Weblog Awards winner. There you go, OG. Via email from a trucker I know personally with names withheld at request. To my friends and family who are not familiar with the trucking industry, get a few extra essentials if you're in a position to do so. Fill your tank with fuel. Truck drivers have hit the proverbial wall, and every tactile thing in your life is moved by them. This goes far beyond the mandate issue. That's just the snapping point for many. There are many factors at play, truckers being the constant proverbial scapegoat for a crumbling supply chain is front and center. I want to be clear that this has been brewing for decades. The horrible state on our Canadian highways is similar to what I've experienced traveling in third world countries. Safety has declined to where there's almost daily fatalities. I've had to unfollow most trucking groups because they're just so negative and defeating, showing all the daily wrecks that don't hit the news. Real undoctored pictures, video, and dash cam footage of quote-unquote professional drivers showing absolutely no regard for human life. What's the answer? Feds throw mass quantities of undocumented drivers who simply have to say they have a license or experience. They pay large sums to handlers that facilitate throwing them right into the fire on our mountainous, snowy, icy highways. I have personally helped drivers that had absolutely no idea how to chain up, free a frozen brake, fuel up a tractor or reefer, add diesel, exhaust fluid, back up one trailer, let alone two, which airline went where, how to check fluid levels, hook up a trailer, etc. That's obviously horrible. And this was in the parking lot. Now to watch them pass people on double yellows over the crest of a hill around a blind corner, driving loaded Super Bs 6 feet from my passenger vehicle at highway speed. I've taken the ditch or shoulder several times this winter alone. By the way, so have I, as I knew my family would be hit and perish when the loaded tailgater couldn't stop in time because I have decades of off-road and trucking experience. Yeah, it can be daunting on the mountainous, snowy, icy highways to have to pass by truckers who seem like they're all over the road. Unfortunately, I could no longer afford to run a viable business in transport. This trucker continues. The rates are the same as in the 90s, but every expense has tripled. My last 3 months hauling grain, I couldn't even pay myself $1. I was just working for the bank. Mary insisting I get out while I could was the best thing to happen to us in years, assuming that's his wife. Maybe somebody else, I don't know. All those long, wasted, unpaid hours of my life never to return. Then months later, she saw her cancer return. We were very thankful a semi with $3,000 plus monthly payment wasn't sitting on the driveway. I also knew that every extra mile I drove on the decaying state of our roads would increase the chance of my ticket being punched. Not a sacrifice my family was prepared to make. I was sick with stress every Sunday night before going to work. Also, people could give me dirty looks, cut me off in the city and on the highway. It didn't matter if I had dynamite, aviation fuel, crude oil, or apples in the trailers. The end result would be the same for them. Explosive. Try and find a place to pull over and rest, eat, use a washroom in Saskatchewan, especially a safe location with adequate room and not just a litter. Saskatchewan, for those of you who don't know, it's a province in Canada. Especially a safe location with adequate room and not just a litter-ridden highway shoulder with a frozen porta potty. How many times did I stop just to see a no truck sign, locked garbage bins, jugs of pee everywhere, and an out of service or locked bathroom? Okay, that's no way to treat our truck drivers. Next is drivers being driven to financial ruin and physical distress with ridiculous fines and penalties. Many of those lie squarely on those kinds of trucking outfits and brokers that push people far beyond their limits. Shippers and receivers as well, but it all falls on drivers that are quickly thrown under the bus. What's the answer? I don't know. Make trucking a recognized trade, keep diesel prices in check, insurance costs will stop escalating if drivers actually qualify for what they're operating without the resulting chaos. You always have this link between chaos and the lack of qualification or competence or integrity and care. A decent wage available for competent, experienced drivers. Definitely support the call for competence and experience, not just in this field, but in all fields. So many of my former colleagues are finding different avenues than driving to earn a living or getting out of the industry entirely. The average age of a trucker is 58. Would you venture out to do this thankless job? Encourage your kids to pursue this. It's nearly $15,000 just to get an A1 now. I assume that's the license that you need to drive these trucks. Even if you love the idea of everything the road has in store for you, good and bad, would you do it today? Maybe give a little space, sprinkle some respect, and consider what a truck driver is currently dealing with on the road before branding us all as the source of domestic terror. I think there's a reckoning ahead. All right, so this was a letter or an email from a trucker published in Small Dead Animals. And we got there because in Canadian newspaper National Post, there's this article about a freedom convoy of truckers who are protesting and becoming a vicarious protest for people who are against the mandates. Truck drivers now have to have proof of vaccination in order to cross the border. And how did he put it? Right at the end there, there's a reckoning ahead. Ivan says, I'd love for you to do a stream of Russian media sources in the West. I haven't seen anything presenting Russia's case for this issue. It would be interesting to see the other side of the dispute. Yeah, I've thought about it. Having some Russian TV interviewers on, or Russian Twitter accounts or newspapers or blogs or something like that. I could do it. The problem is that I'm not sure yet how I would do it. Have the Russian on screen and just read it in Russian, translate it in English, or do like a rough Google Translate just for the sake of giving people who are watching something to look at other than Cyrillic. I got to think about it. When am I doing an interview with the Geopolitics and Empire podcast? I don't know. Don't know. Haven't heard of them. Haven't spoken with them. And I don't know. Do I feel there will be a hot war? Seems like there could be. It could. Depends on what. Yeah, I feel there will be a hot war, but it depends obviously on a million different factors. What are the main factions' ideas? Okay, we saw those comments. All right. Well, we'll probably stop there. We read Der Spiegel. We read this thing about truckers and the trucking convoy in Canada. I know you have issues of truckers and supply chains and mandates in the US as well. I think we'll leave it there. Feel free to drop articles in the comments or in the chat if there are other things you'd like me to go over. Any good articles on the French position, any good articles on various national positions on the Russia-Ukraine NATO conflict. I enjoy reading them together with you, and we'll probably just keep doing that for a couple of days. All right, everybody. Good to see you. Have a nice night. Be well. Bye.